to reduce the deficit. Mr. President, I'll soon be reintroducing the same legislation that I've introduced in past years to end this misalignment of the tax code. Mr. President, I would now ask the unanimous consent that I be allowed to proceed as though in morning business for 8 minutes.
Without objection.
This is on another matter, and that's why I'm doing that, Mr. President. The Department of Justice announced, Mr. President, if I did not already do so, I would ask unanimous consent that the balance of that statement that I was giving be inserted in the record at that point.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the Department of Justice announced earlier this week that Abdul Qadir Warsaim, an accused member of the terrorist group al-Shabaab, has been indicted on charges of providing material support to al-Shabaab and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, conspiring to teach and demonstrate the making of explosives, possessing firearms and explosives in furtherance of crimes of violence, and other violations of federal law. He will be tried for these offenses in federal court in New York. Warsaim is a Somali national who was captured in the Gulf region in late April and taken to a U.S. Navy vessel for detention and interrogation. The Department of Defense has stated that the interrogation was conducted by an interagency team comprised of U.S. military personnel with assistance from the high-value detainee interrogation group. After the completion of this interrogation and a hiatus of several days, Warsaim was turned over to a team of FBI officials for law enforcement questioning, and in that he waived his Miranda rights and continued to talk. This case appears to be an example of our national security and law enforcement teams working together in the manner that we would hope they would toward the twin objectives of collecting critical intelligence information and ensuring a successful criminal prosecution of the detainee. Published reports indicate that Warsaim was captured by American military forces on a boat in international waters between Yemen and Somalia after the U.S. acquired intelligence indicating that a significant terrorist figure was on board the vessel. Under these circumstances, it was appropriate for the military to detain and interrogate Warsaim to obtain actionable intelligence. The United States is currently engaged in military operations pursuant to the 2002 authorization for the use of military force. As the Supreme Court held 7 years ago in the case of Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, the capture and detention of both lawful and unlawful combatants is a, quote, fundamental and accepted incident to war, close quote. I understand these interrogations were conducted in a manner fully consistent with the interrogation techniques authorized under the Army Field Manual on Interrogations. Once our national security team determined that the collection of actionable intelligence had been completed, a separate decision was made on the basis of the specific facts of this case as to the best forum in which to prosecute Warsaim for his alleged crimes. The indictment sets forth evidence that Warsaim violated a number of federal statutes, including sections of the Criminal Code prohibiting trafficking in explosives, use of dangerous weapons, acts of international terrorism, providing material support to foreign terrorist organizations, and receiving military-type training from foreign terrorist organizations, making him a candidate for prosecution in a federal court with jurisdiction over such violations. Warsaim also appears to have engaged in acts of terrorism and material support to terrorism, both of which are crimes under the Military Commissions Act if they are committed, quote, in the context of and associated with hostilities, close quote, against the United States. What has not been resolved, Mr. President, was whether or not Warsaim meets the jurisdictional threshold in the Military Commissions Act of having acted in the context of hostilities against the United States and having engaged in or materially supported such hostility. The administration's national security team unanimously agreed that prosecution in federal court was the better option and the one most likely to lead to a conviction under the facts of this case. Our federal prosecutors and federal courts have a proven track record in prosecuting terrorists. 2 years ago, the Justice Department informed us that there were 208 inmates in federal prisons who had been sentenced for crimes related to international terrorism, and an additional 139 inmates who had been sentenced for crimes related to domestic terrorism. By contrast, prosecution of the Warsame case before a military commission would have raised a difficult jurisdictional issue that could have resulted in dismissal or even acquittal. Critics of the decision to try Warsame in federal court apparently would prefer that he be tried before a military commission, even though he might be less likely to be convicted there due to the jurisdictional issue. I disagree with that position. In my view, the most appropriate forum for trial should be determined as it was here, on the basis of the nature of the offense, the nature of the evidence, and the likelihood of successful prosecution. The executive branch officials who made the determination in this case are in a much better position to weigh those factors and make that judgment than is the Congress. And by the way, the approach taken by the administration in this case is consistent with the bipartisan detainee provisions included in the National Defense Authorization Act as reported by the Senate Armed Services Committee last month. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that the balance of this statement also be inserted in the record in full.
Without objection.
And I thank the Chair and I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from North Dakota.
I rise today along with my fellow colleagues to again address the need to reduce our deficit and our debt. The United States is the strongest country in the world, in the history of the world. But that won't be the case for long if we don't solve our deficit and our debt crisis. It's vital that we solve it now for our generation, but it's vital that we solve it for future generations as well. Now, the wealth, the economic activity of this country is created by the private sector, by hard-working men and women, not by the government. Government creates the forum, the environment, if you will, that fosters or allows economic activity. But the key is government shouldn't just allow economic activity. The government needs to create an environment that truly empowers, that promotes economic activity, that encourages private investment, that encourages entrepreneurship, business expansion and job growth, innovation, the very entrepreneurial activity that has built this country. That's the success of America. That's the strength of our country. That is how America has become the greatest economic powerhouse in the history of the world. And that's why our people enjoy the highest standard of living. But our current administration believes that more government is the answer. More spending, more regulation, and more taxes. It's not the answer, that's the problem. And it's making the situation worse. Let's go through just some of the economic statistics. Today we have 13.9, almost 14 million people unemployed. Our unemployment rate is over 9%. Gas prices, since the current administration took office, are up to more than $3.50 a gallon. That's almost a 100% increase in the cost of gasoline. Our federal debt is closing on $14.5 trillion. For every man, woman, and child in this country, that's almost $50,000 for every single person. We have 45 million people on food stamps today. Health insurance, in spite of the health insurance legislation, health insurance premiums are rising and home values are going down. Clearly, we need to get our economy going. We need to get people back to work. We need that economic growth and dynamism that has been the hallmark of this country. And clearly, we need to reduce our deficit and our debt. Now, the reality is we can do it. We absolutely can do it, and we've done it before. But we need to begin with a comprehensive plan to reduce the deficit and the debt. Any agreement to raise the debt ceiling needs to include a comprehensive agreement to reduce the deficit and the debt. And by a comprehensive agreement, I mean something that includes a balanced budget amendment, reduction in spending, and living within our means on an ongoing basis. And it means reforming entitlement programs to save them from bankruptcy, not only to protect our seniors today, but to make sure that those programs are solvent and there for future generations. All these things and more can go into a comprehensive plan, but we need a comprehensive plan to reduce the deficit, to reduce the debt, as part of this debt ceiling issue that we need to deal with now. Not put off, but deal with now. If you think about it, a balanced budget amendment just makes sense. 49 out of 50 states have either a constitutional or a statutory requirement that they balance their budget. Not just this year, but every year. States balance their budget, cities balance their budget, businesses balance their budget, families balance their budget, live within their means. Our federal government needs to do the same. Our federal government needs that fiscal responsibility, needs that fiscal discipline. Also, if you think about it, a balanced budget gets everybody involved. It gets everybody involved here in Congress. It takes two-thirds majority in both the Senate and the House to pass a balanced budget amendment. And then what happens? It goes out to the states. It goes out to the 50 states, and 3/4 of the states must ratify that balanced budget amendment in order for it to be approved. So you not only have everybody at the federal level working to live within our means and balance the budget, but you get all the states involved as well. So this is a challenging problem, no question about it, getting on top of these deficits and our long-term debt, not only now but for the future as well. So let's have everyone involved in a balanced budget amendment. Of course, at the same time, we've got to reduce our spending both now and make sure that we continue to live within our means going forward. And the statistics are very clear. The statistics right now show that this year the federal government will take in about $2.2 trillion in revenue. So our revenue is about $2.2 trillion. But our expenses are $3.7 trillion. That's about a $1.5 trillion deficit. And this year, actually, it will be larger than that number. So you can see that's why our federal debt now is closing in on $14.5 trillion. We're borrowing 40 cents of every single dollar we spend. We're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar we spend, and every single day our debt goes up $4 billion. Every single day our debt is growing by $4 billion. That is simply unsustainable. And that is why any vote to increase the debt ceiling must include a comprehensive plan to reduce our deficit and our debt. No question we need to control our spending, but at the same time, as we do that, at the same time, in order to truly solve the problem, we've also got to create an environment, as I said at the outset, create a government environment that not only encourages private investment, but truly empowers private investment across our nation. This next chart shows some of the challenges, some of the barriers, if you will, to doing that. We need legal tax and regulatory certainty to encourage private investment. A pro-business, a pro-growth, a pro-jobs environment is one that creates legal tax and regulatory certainty to not only encourage but empower private investment. One of the ways we do this is by reducing regulatory burden. We have incredible regulatory burden at the federal level. We need to find ways to reduce that. And that's what this next chart shows. Earlier this year, President Obama issued an executive order that proposes to review regulations that may be outmoded, ineffective, insufficient, or excessively burdensome, and also to modify, streamline, or even repeal them. Just a week ago, he said again, quote, "What I have done," and this is unprecedented, "is that I've said to each agency, look at the regulations that are already on the books, and if they don't make sense, let's get rid of them." End quote. That's what he said. And I absolutely agree with that. Yet over the past 2 years, the administration has issued 502 proposed or enacted regulations, and it's on pace this year to exceed $100 billion in total regulatory cost burdens to industry. That is a huge regulatory burden. This chart shows the cost of major new regulations in billions of dollars over the last 30 years. As you can see, when the cost of regulation is low, the economy is strong. And when the cost of regulation is high, as it is now, the economy is weak. And more importantly, job growth is weak. Look at the year 2010. In 2010, you see the highest regulatory burden in adjusted dollars in the last 30 years. And how did our economy do in 2010? Senator Roberts, my colleague from Kansas, myself and others have taken the President up on his pledge to review these regulations. We've introduced the Regulatory Responsibility for Our Economy Act, a measure that would give teeth to the President's directive. Regulators will have to show the benefits of a new rule and show that the benefits outweigh its costs. They'll have to show that it imposes the least burden on society and that it maximizes economic benefits. That's an approach that would not only encourage but truly empower private investment. Let me give you another example of what I'm talking about with regulatory burden. Again, trying to create that legal tax and regulatory certainty that stimulates the private investment we need to get this economy going. Not more government spending. We're already spending way beyond our means, but more private investment that gets this economy going, that gets people back to work, that generates the revenue that, along with reduction in government spending, will help us reduce our deficit and, over time, reduce our debt. But when we talk about onerous regulations, another key area of our economy that is incredibly overburdened and that we see a prevention of investment because of the regulatory burden is the energy industry. My next chart illustrates the long reach of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and how it is sidelining and dampening job growth in the energy sector. It shows a long, complex obstacle course, if you will, of expensive standards and procedures and regulations that are not only being implemented now, but go on for the foreseeable future. How would you like to be an energy company looking at investing in any kind of energy, traditional or renewable, putting hundreds of millions, billions of dollars into new plants, into new types of investments, whether it's producing oil and gas, whether it's wind, whether it's biofuels, whether it's biomass, solar, you name it. How would you like to go and start to make those investments on behalf of your shareholders and have some idea what rate of return you're going to be able to get and what rules of the road you're going to have to follow? And this is just a small sampling of the regulations that are now coming into being, but will continue to come into place for the foreseeable future. At a time of high oil prices, unrest in the Middle East, and sluggish economic growth, we are not only failing to provide Americans with affordable energy for their homes and vehicles, but we are actually discouraging the very investment that will make it happen. And this is just one small example. To remedy that, we need new legislation. Mr. President, I know you and others are working on a lot of that new legislation that will streamline regulations and encourage investment. And I'm just going to give a couple examples. One of them that I'm working on, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, my colleague from West Virginia, has introduced. It's called the EPA Fair Play Act. And it would prohibit rescinding properly approved 404 permits. When EPA submits or approves a 404 permit for mining, once that's approved, it says you can't arbitrarily withdraw it. So a company that's invested millions or billions of dollars can't find itself high and dry after it's already gotten the proper permits. Another example is of legislation that we've introduced that would make a big difference is Defending America's Affordable Energy and Jobs Act. Primary sponsor is Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming. This legislation ensures that Congress makes the call on regulating greenhouse gases, not the EPA through regulatory fiat. Or another example that I would offer up is the Gas Accessibility and Stabilization Act that I am pleased to co-sponsor with Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri and others that will simplify the complex rules and regulations that govern refining and distribution of fuel throughout the United States. And there are many other examples that I could give as well. But the point is, with 14 million Americans out of work, we can no longer delay. And it's not just regulations, it's legal, tax, and regulatory certainty that will empower investment by people, by entrepreneurs, by companies all over this great nation. And we don't just have to talk about regulations. Let's talk about trade for a minute. Right now we have 3 free trade agreements pending. The U.S., South Korea, free trade agreement, a free trade agreement with Panama, and another free trade agreement with Colombia. These agreements have been pending since 2007. The benefit of these agreements, for example, they would generate more than $13 billion a year in economic activity for this country and create up to 250,000 American jobs. If we fail to act, we will lose on the order of 380,000 jobs to the European Union and to Canada, who have already approved their trade agreements. So why aren't we dealing with those trade agreements here today, now, when we have 14 million people out of work, when we have an economy that we need to get going, and when we have huge deficits and debt, a debt that's increasing at the rate of $4 billion a day? Well, the deadline on the debt limit is fast approaching, and the time to act is now. The simple truth is this: we cannot continue to spend more, tax more, and regulate more. It's time to control our spending and create an environment that unleashes the entrepreneurial power, the entrepreneurial spirit of the American people. And we can do it. In fact, we've done it before. We just need the will to act for ourselves today and for the benefit of future generations. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me begin by referring to the front page of today's Washington Post, the headline, Obama, Social Security on table, cuts offered in debt talks. Mr. President, I hope very much that that headline is wrong, because, in fact, Social Security, which is perhaps the most successful federal program in the history of our country, has not contributed 1 penny to our deficit or our national debt. So the idea of lumping Social Security and cuts in Social Security into a discussion about our deficit and our national debt is absolutely wrong, unfair to the tens of millions of seniors and people with disabilities who benefit from that program. As you know, Mr. President, as the American people know, Social Security is independently funded through the payroll tax. Every worker, every employer contributes into that fund. And Social Security today has a $2.6 trillion surplus that is projected, in fact, to grow to over $4 trillion by the year 2023. We, of course, need a vigorous debate about how we deal with the deficit crisis and our national debt. But Social Security, independently funded, with a $2.6 trillion surplus, having not contributed one nickel to the national debt, should not be part of that debate. Mr. President, I understand that there are many people in the Senate, many of my Republican colleagues, who do not like Social Security, who do not believe in Social Security, because essentially they do not believe that the government should be involved in retirement insurance for seniors or for people with disabilities. And I respect their point of view. I very strongly disagree with it. And the real problem that they have is that Social Security is enormously popular. Poll after poll shows the American people do not want to see Social Security cut. They do not want to see the retirement age raised, and they most certainly do not want to see Social Security privatized, because, in fact, Social Security has succeeded. It has accomplished the goals of those people who founded that program in the 1930s. In the 1930s, about half of America's senior citizens lived in poverty. Today, that number, while it is too high, is down to 10%. More importantly, given the incredible instability in the economy that we have seen for decades, especially in the last few years, where millions of people have lost some or all of their retirement savings that they had invested in Wall Street, Mr. President, over the last 75 years, not one American has lost one dime that he or she was entitled to in terms of Social Security benefits. That's a pretty good record. Every American getting every penny that was owed to him or her for 75 years. It is a program that has worked. It is a program that is working today. It is a program that can pay out every benefit owed to every eligible American for the next 25 years. It is a program that should not be cut. But more to the point, in terms of President Obama, one of the problems that we have as a nation is that it is no great secret that many of our people are losing faith in government for a whole lot of reasons. But certainly one of the reasons is that politicians say one thing and they do something else. They campaign on a certain promise. They give a speech, everybody applauds. 2 years later, well, I guess I have to change my mind, can't quite do this. And let's be clear, when President Obama ran for the presidency in 2008, he was a strong advocate of Social Security, made it very clear to the American people that he was not going to cut benefits. Let me just quote from a speech that the President gave, who was then Senator Barack Obama, on September 6, 2008. And this is what he said, and I quote, "John McCain's campaign has suggested that the best answer for the growing pressures on Social Security might be to cut cost of living adjustments or raise the retirement age. Let me be clear, I will not do either." End of quote. I will not do either. Today's Washington Post, Obama, Social Security on table, cuts offered in debt talks. Mr. President, on April 16, 2008, Barack Obama candidate Obama said, and I quote, "The alternatives, like raising the retirement age or cutting benefits or raising the payroll tax on everybody, including people making less than $97,000 a year, which is now up to $106,000 a year, those are not good policy options." End of quote. On November 11, 2007, candidate Obama said, quote, "I believe that cutting Social Security benefits is not the right answer and that raising the retirement age is not the best option," end of quote. The American people expect the President of the United States to keep his word. Now, again, I am not privy to the discussions that may be going on right this moment in the White House about some grand debt, national debt negotiations. All I can tell you, and it may be accurate, it may not, the media has been wrong once or twice in history, but according to today's Washington Post, the President is considering lowering cost of living adjustments for Social Security recipients, even though, by the way, as you well know, Mr. President, Social Security recipients have not received a COLA in the last 2 years. So let's be clear. Today, despite significant inflation on health care costs, prescription drugs, seniors have not received a COLA in 2 years. Disabled vets have not received a COLA in 2 years. But apparently, the President negotiating with the Republicans is considering lowering COLAs in the future. Now, it's important to understand what that means. According to the Strengthened Social Security Campaign, which is a coalition of senior groups who are working hard to protect Social Security, changing the way Social Security cost of living adjustments are calculated, as the President may be considering. Again, I do not want to make a definitive statement. All I'm doing is telling you what is in the Washington Post front page today. Is it true? I can't say. But if it is true, this would cost senior citizens hundreds of dollars a year in lower benefits. Now, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the adoption of the so-called chained CPI, this is a different formulation. I happen to believe, and have introduced legislation to this effect, that the current COLAs for seniors are not accurate and are too low, because they do not, in a realistic way, measure what seniors are purchasing, which to a significant degree has to do with health care and prescription drugs. When you're old, you're not primarily buying laptop computers or big television sets. You're often spending a lot of your money on health care, prescription drugs. Those costs are going up. So I think today's COLA is too low in that it does not reflect the real purchasing needs of seniors. According to the CBO, if in fact the government adopted the so-called chained CPI, which is a different formulation, which is even lower than the current inadequate formulation, annual COLAs under this proposal would cut benefits by $112 billion over 10 years. And here's the important point for individuals. The Social Security Administration chief actuary estimates the effects of this change would be that beneficiaries who retire at the age of 65 and receive average benefits would get $560 less a year at age 75 than they would under current law, and get $1,000 less a year at age 85. People are living longer. Many of our people, God bless them, reach 75, reach 85. To say to somebody that when they reach 85, don't have a whole lot of money, that as a result of these cuts they'll get $1,000 a year less, is totally, to my mind, unacceptable and not something that should be supported by the President or by any member of the Senate. Mr. President, the American people, despite what many of my Republican friends are saying, are pretty clear on some basic issues regarding how we address the serious problem of our national debt and our deficit. And what the American people say in poll after poll after poll, and they say it to me on the streets in Burlington, Vermont, or any other place in Vermont that I go, they say that what we must have is shared sacrifice, that at a time when poverty is increasing in this country, when we have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world, that when millions of workers today are working longer hours for lower wages, when unemployment is sky high, when seniors have not received a COLA in 2 years, when young people are finding it hard to get any jobs at all, that it is immoral and bad economics to do deficit reduction on the backs of those people, of working families, of children, of the elderly, of the sick, of the poor. Overwhelmingly, the American people say that is wrong, especially at a time when the wealthiest people have never had it so good, when corporate profits are soaring. Mr. President, you may have seen an article, front page New York Times, a few days ago. CEOs of major corporations have seen a 23% increase last year in their compensation packages. 23%. We're in the midst of a horrendous recession. Real wages for American workers are going down. CEOs are doing great. Wall Street is doing great. Corporate profits are soaring. And we have dozens of corporations who make huge profits, don't pay a nickel in taxes. We have a military budget today 3 times higher than it was in 1997. So what the vast majority of the people say, and they say it in polls all over the place, is you need to go forward with shared sacrifice, not as the Republicans suggest, cut programs for the most vulnerable people in this country, throw millions of kids off of Medicaid, end Medicare as we know it right now, make it impossible for working-class families to send their kids to college. That's not what the American people are saying. A recent survey by Public Policy Polling in swing states asked the question, and when voters in Ohio, this is just the other day it came out, were asked this spring if they would support or oppose cutting spending on Social Security to reduce the national debt, only 16% favored that approach compared to 80% who were opposed. Similar, identical results, very close results in states such as Missouri, Montana, and Minnesota. That was just out in the papers yesterday. Meanwhile, strong majorities, including Republicans, favor increased revenue from the wealthiest Americans and most profitable corporations should be part of any deficit reduction package. So, Mr. President, let me just conclude by saying that I hope very much President Obama does not reach any agreement with the Republicans, which includes cuts in Social Security. Social Security has not contributed 1 nickel to our national debt. It is a successful program widely supported by the American people who are benefiting from it every single day. More to the point, President Obama, when he campaigned for office, made it clear, told the American people that if he was elected president, he would not be cutting Social Security. And the American people expect him to keep his word. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Utah is recognized.
Mr. President, yesterday I spoke about the matter of tax expenditures. I would like to expand on that topic today. Tax expenditures are becoming a critical issue in the negotiations over the debt ceiling. Democrats, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to finish my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. Democrats say that they want to eliminate them. They refer to them as loopholes or spending through a tax code. This might be a good political argument, but it bears little relationship to the understanding of tax expenditures in tax law or tax policy. Yesterday, I outlined a general definition of tax expenditures. They are most definitely not spending through the tax code, as President Obama so creatively put it. And they are most definitely not, by and large, loopholes. Rather, they were intentionally included in the tax code by Congress in order to realize certain policy goals. What tax expenditures are is an opportunity for families and businesses to keep more of their income. Unfortunately, rather than have a serious conversation about tax expenditures and tax policy, President Obama and his liberal allies are intent on setting new ground for juvenile public discourse. Faced with a $14.3 trillion debt going up every day, Social Security and Medicare programs that are set for bankruptcy, ruining American seniors, and a legitimate fiscal crisis that poses a clear and present danger to the nation's security and the security of America's families and businesses, President Obama is again talking about shared sacrifice. Well, I like the term. The only thing is I would prefer to have shared prosperity, because all we're going to get out of this administration is shared sacrifice, which means everybody's going to suffer. I'd like to have shared prosperity where everybody is lifted. The first time we really started hearing about this concept of shared sacrifice was in the debate over Obamacare. For those who are unfamiliar with Washington speak, this is what the President meant by shared sacrifice. Quote, I am going to raise taxes on families and businesses by over $500 billion, and I am going to do it by shaking down businesses, unquote. He made them an offer they couldn't refuse. Pay up now or pay up more later. So when we started hearing again about shared sacrifice, we knew what was coming. More proposals for tax increases. But I have to say I remain shocked at how ham-fisted most of these proposals are. They really are nothing but a series of bad talking points that can be used for the President's re-election campaign. These talking points were tired by the end of the 1936 presidential election. I would not be surprised to see President Obama dust off Franklin Roosevelt's speeches and start railing against economic royalists by the end of the debt limit negotiations. Sadly, the Senate's leadership has followed suit. After making a big to-do about keeping the Senate in session to address the fiscal crisis, we are spending this week debating a non-binding resolution demanding higher taxes on millionaires. Really? The Democrats' solution to $14.3 trillion in debt is to attack corporate jets. Seriously? $3 billion over 10 years? Last time they did that, they wound up with their tails between their legs in 1990, and then 1993 had to reverse the whole thing because it cost thousands of jobs. I never underestimate liberals' lack of respect for the intelligence of the American people, but this is a new low. Do they really think that ordinary Americans are so consumed with class hatred that they will respond like Pavlovian dogs to the criticism of corporate jets and forget that it was programmatic liberalism, not bonus depreciation of corporate jets, of tax benefits for energy companies, that got us into this debt crisis? And this is really how the left perceives Republicans. They want to score some cheap points against Republicans by going after corporate jets, as though all Republicans love corporate jets. I'd venture to say that an awful lot of corporate jets are owned by very wealthy Democrats. What are we going to get next week, a tax on monocles and top hats? Maybe we will spend next week debating a non-binding resolution on the need to tax Madras blazers for the good of the country. Unfortunately, not all of the Democrat proposals are a laughing matter. They have been down this road in the past, pushing tax increases on luxury items like yachts. Today, the press ridiculed Republicans for, quote, defending the yachting class, unquote. There is no yachting class in this country unless you count the Democratic Party of Martha's Vineyard. But there is a class of people who build yachts. This is what happened to those people the last time the Democrats engaged in class warfare of this kind. In the 1990 budget deal, a new luxury excise tax was created applying to yachts, aircraft, jewelry, and furs, first applying to the 1991 year. The similarities are eerie. Faced with soaring deficits, Democrats insisted that revenues be part of the equation. And how did this work out? The tax was repealed in 1993 because, as the Democratic-controlled Senate Finance Committee report, as reported by the Budget Committee, explains, quote, during the recent recession, the boat, aircraft, jewelry, and fur industries have suffered job losses and increased unemployment. The committee believes that it is appropriate to eliminate the burden these taxes impose on the interests of fostering economic recovery in those and related industries, unquote. Republicans are not defending the yachting class. They are defending the people whose jobs will be lost to Democratic class warfare. Of course, the left cannot contain themselves to these targeted tax increases. Just today we read in the paper that the President is eager to reform Social Security. Yet it appears that he's only willing to do so if we let the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts expire. Tax cuts which only last December the President acknowledged were necessary components of our economic recovery. And I would not be surprised to see the old Democratic hobby horse, an increase in the Social Security tax max, make an appearance in the Democrats' list of demands. These are non-starters, and everyone understands why. These broad-based tax increases would be a weight around our economic recovery. But the issue of tax expenditures continues to cause confusion and must be addressed. Those who advocate limiting or eliminating these tax expenditures suggest that they are spending and loopholes that benefit wealthy individuals. Yesterday, I offered a grown-up definition of what a tax expenditure is. Today, I would like to highlight which are, in fact, the top tax expenditures. What we will find is that the tax expenditures that would generate the largest amount of revenue are also those that are available to the middle class, enabling them to give their churches and synagogues, and to save for a home, for college, and for retirement. To really get at meaningful deficit reduction, Democrats would have to eliminate these expenditures. Is that really what they want to do? That might be a good question at the President's next press conference. Maybe someone could give him a copy of this chart right here that we're going to put up and ask which of these tax expenditures he's willing to eliminate in the interest of deficit reduction. Number one, the exclusion for employer-provided health care. Is he going to want to get rid of that? That's 13% of all tax expenditures. How about home mortgage interest deduction? Is he going to get rid of that? How about preferential, that's 9%. How about preferential rates for dividends and capital gains? That's 8%. Exclusion of Medicare benefits? They're going to do away with that? Well, that's 7%. Net exclusion of defined benefit pension contributions and earnings? Are they going to attack our pensions? That's 6%. An earned income tax credit? My gosh, that's 5%. Deduction for state and local taxes, except real property? That's 5%. Number 8, net exclusion of defined contribution/earnings. That's 4%. How about number 9, exclusion of capital gains at death? 4%. And how about number 10, deductions for charitable contributions? That's 4%. I venture to say hardly any American's going to want to do away with all those in the interest of getting more revenue so the Democrats can spend it back here. Well, look at that chart. It's a list of the top 10 tax expenditures. You know, maybe someone could give him a copy of this chart and ask which of these tax expenditures he's willing to eliminate in the interest of deficit reduction. I encourage all my friends to look at this chart. It is a list of the top 10 tax expenditures. With the rhetoric coming out of the White House, you might be surprised to learn the tax benefits for yachts and corporate jets are not in the top 2. Not only do they not make the top 10, they don't even come close. If you take the so-called savings that would come from the corporate jet tax approach of the President, it would take us 3,000 years to even reach the approximately $800 billion stimulus package. In the context of the President's trillion-dollar deficits, they are statistical noise. So what are the big tax expenditures? Well, number 1 is an issue from the Obamacare debate. It is the exclusion for employer-provided health insurance. The exclusion of employer-provided health insurance from income is the single largest tax expenditure, representing 13% of tax expenditures. Yesterday, a member of the other side's leadership pointed out that the largest tax expenditure is one for corporations. Boy, is he wrong. Here's what I said, and I quote, "The biggest single deduction is the employer's exclusion for health care premiums. So employers are able to exclude from income the amount of money they spend for health insurance for their employees. That's the biggest," unquote. Well, that's just an incorrect description of law that they're arguing. Employers always have been allowed and should be allowed a deduction for the cost of benefits it provides to its employees. Employee compensation, including the provision of health insurance to one's employees, is a cost of doing business, and thus properly deductible by the employer so as to accurately measure the income or profit of the employer. That has never been considered a tax expenditure. The exclusion at issue, which is a tax expenditure, refers to the employee's tax treatment, not to the employer's tax treatment. That is, most compensation that an employee receives from his employer is includable as taxable income. One of the few exceptions to that general rule is that employees do not include in taxable income the value of employer-provided health insurance. Coming in at number 2 is the home mortgage interest deduction. Now, this expenditure alone accounts for 9% of all tax expenditures. The third largest, there we have the lower rate on capital gains and dividends. Do away with this expenditure and the rate on capital gains and dividends will almost triple in about 18 months. Capital gains and dividends represent 8% of all tax expenditures. What's number 4? Here we have an untaxed piece of Medicare benefits. Imagine that, Mr. President. I wonder how many folks on the other side realize this, or even if the President does. When my friends on the other side categorically talk about cutting back tax expenditures as the yellow brick road to deficit reduction, I wonder if they know that hiding behind the curtain is an increase in the after-tax cost of Medicare. Do my friends on the other side realize this? A few months ago, a liberal group ran an ad showing my friend, the chairman of the House Budget Committee, Paul Ryan, pushing an old woman in a wheelchair over a cliff. His crime? Recommending policy changes that would prevent the inevitable bankruptcy of Medicare. I'm not going to hold my breath waiting for this same group to pull the fire alarm because the Democrats' talk of eliminating tax expenditures might result in seniors getting hit with higher taxes on Medicare benefits. But this is what the President and the Democrats are talking about. If they are serious about using tax expenditures to reduce the deficit, these are the things that will have to be on the table. These are the big expenditures. This expenditure is real. You can look it up in the handy tax expenditure publication from the Nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation. And it is significant, representing 7% of all tax expenditures, the exclusion of Medicare benefits. At number 5 is the pre-tax treatment for defined benefit pension plan contributions and the inside build-up on the accounts. This is a tax benefit that reduces the cost of those workers who make the decision to save for retirement. This represents 6% of all tax expenditures. What's number 6? It is the refundable earned income tax credit, the EIC. When folks describe tax expenditures as spending through the tax code, this is one that could properly be labeled that way. Under congressional budget rules, this one, for the most part, scores as spending. That's not the case with the other tax expenditures on this list. Refundable tax credits score as spending because the government cuts a check to the taxpayer. With the other tax benefits on this list, the taxpayer is receiving a portion of the money back in the form of reduced taxes. Now, there's some serious tax hikes there. This tax expenditure accounts for 5% of tax expenditures. Number 7 is the deduction for state and local taxes. My friends on the other side need to be particularly careful with this one. So far, they would hit seniors, families that have health insurance through their employers, people with mortgages, and anyone who owns stocks and bonds. But with this, many Democrats risk alienating every last taxpayer in their states. Removing this deduction is going to hit high-tax states hard. If you're from a so-called blue state, it is likely that constituents are already heavily burdened with state and local taxes. Take away this and you will, in effect, drive up the marginal rate of your constituents who take their deduction by as much as 35%. I'm convinced that many of the inroads Democrats made between 2006 and 2008 were due to carefully crafted Trojan horse campaigns. Skillful operatives ran Democratic campaigns promising moderate tax and spending policies that would be respectful of families and businesses. But once that Trojan horse got inside the Capitol and former Speaker Pelosi and President Obama took charge, Frustrated liberals spilled out and started taxing anything that could move to pay for the largest expansion of government since Lyndon Johnson was in office. Removing the deduction for state and local taxes might be the final act that restores purple America to its traditional red hue. At 5% of all tax expenditures, this would represent a massive tax increase, this net exclusion of defined benefit pension contributions / earnings. I guess that's number 7, the deduction from state and local taxes, except for real property. What's number 8? This is the pre-tax treatment for the contributions workers make to their defined contribution plans and the inside build-up on the accounts. Many of us know of these retirement plans as 401k plans. At 4% of tax expenditures, this is a significant incentive to families to save for retirement. Number 9 is a bit more obscure, but no less critical for families. It is the tax expenditure for the step-up in basis at death. We all know the saying that nothing is as certain as death and taxes. Well, if this tax expenditure were eliminated, this step-up in basis at death, this saying would take on an even darker meaning. Death could now be taxed twice. First, the decedent's estate might get hit with the death tax. Then the decedent's heirs would be subject to tax again on the gain embedded in any inherited asset should they decide to sell it. This accounts for 4% of tax expenditures. We close with number 10, the tax expenditure that is probably the most important one to my constituents in Utah. It is the tax benefit for donations to charities other than education and health care institutions. When you make your weekly or yearly donation to your church, you can now deduct it for tax purposes. This charitable deduction represents 4% of all tax expenditures. And the folks in my state all pay tithing, almost all of them. That's 10% of their gross income. I do it every year. Now, I got to tell you, you'd hit a lot of really charitable people and a lot of churches with the loss of that one, number 10, and yet that's the smallest of the whole 10. As the chart shows, these widespread everyday tax policies account for almost 2/3 of tax expenditures. We're not talking about yachts or corporate jets. Now, I've already suggested that rolling back many of these expenditures would have an immediate adverse impact on American families and taxpayers. They would also undercut long-standing federal policies promoting saving, home ownership, and charitable giving. Let's turn first to retirement security. About half of Americans save for retirement. The overwhelming bipartisan consensus is that this number is way too low. Ideally, all American workers would be saving or should be saving for retirement. More savings means less financial stress on Social Security and Medicare. Most importantly, it means retirees can enjoy their retirement if they can rely on a nest egg. That's why there has been a bipartisan desire to incentivize retirement savings through worker participation in retirement plans. The time-honored method has been to offer a tax benefit up front in the case of traditional defined benefit of the traditional defined benefit plan, traditional defined contribution, or traditional IRA. The benefit remains untaxed during the individual's working years. It is only taxed when received in retirement. By contrast, Roth pension plans and IRAs provide a tax benefit on the back end when a worker retires and begins drawing on the account. Former Finance Committee Chairman William Roth captured the policy rationale best by noting the deliberate tax policy bias towards savings. Chairman Roth used to make the point with a rhetorical question. He'd ask, quote, "Is there any bad saving?" unquote. Of course, the answer is no. One thing we know for sure, curtail or eliminate the tax expenditure for retirement savings, and the after-tax cost of savings will rise. Savers will react. It is true that some will continue to save, but it is also true that they will have less to save if they choose to do so. For middle-income taxpayers, it will probably mean lower savings rates. Is that a good policy to put in place? Consider this. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation for 2009, over half of households paid no income tax. 49% of Americans shouldered 100% of the income tax burden. The half shouldering the income tax burden are also, generally speaking, the part of the population making sound personal decisions, like saving for retirement. That behavior is good in both a micro and macro sense. In the micro sense, workers are sacrificing current consumption for security and a better standard of living in the future. On a macro sense, the collective behavior of these citizens stabilizes our aging society. To encourage this kind of sacrifice, our tax policy provides a tangible tax benefit. Take away that tax benefit and, as with raising taxes on anything else, you will get less of the behavior. Take away the tax benefit and you will get less saving for retirement. Mr. President, does that make any sense? In order to avoid restraining the rapid growth in government spending, our friends on the other side would have us send the wrong policy signal to half of our population that saves. They would add to the burden of those who are already shouldering the entire burden of funding the federal government. At the same time, by discouraging saving and personal responsibility, we would further unleash the appetite of those who want to spend more. Take another look at the chart. Add up the tax expenditures from defined benefit plans and defined contribution plans. They account for 10% of tax expenditures. Over 5 years, the revenue from these expenditures amounts to almost $700 billion, with a B, billion dollars. On a per-year average basis, it is $140 billion in incentives for growing government spending. Do we want a society where more saving is encouraged? Or do we want a society where dependency and more government spending are encouraged? Do we want to look more like Switzerland? Or do we want to look more like Greece? The answer to this question is clear to the citizens of this country. Unfortunately, not all of their representatives seem to have thought through the implications of going after tax expenditures. To get at this from another angle, I would like to discuss the impact on taxpayers of cutting back some of these tax expenditures that come in the form of itemized deductions. I'm going to examine the effects of cutting back these itemized deductions by applying President Obama's budget proposal to cap itemized deductions at 28%. It is clear that some in the White House are pushing this 28% cap hard in the negotiations over the debt limit. As noted before, itemized deductions generally are considered tax expenditures. But itemized deductions impact a number of basic, long-standing features of American life. Itemized deductions include the home mortgage interest deduction, the charitable contribution deduction, and the state and local tax deduction. The President is proposing to chisel away at these itemized deductions, and we should carefully reflect on what that would really mean. President Obama has proposed repeatedly, quote, to limit the tax rate at which high-income taxpayers can take itemized deductions to 28%, unquote. It appears that this proposal is designed to lessen the benefit to higher-income taxpayers of itemized deductions. The Joint Committee on Taxation says that this provision would mean the federal government would collect an additional $293 billion in taxes over 10 years. True to form, this is just another version of the same soak-the-rich play that the left has been running for decades. From their perspective, it is unfair that higher-income individuals get a more valuable tax benefit than lower-income individuals. But this perspective mischaracterizes the critical issue. The 35% bracket was established by Congress with an understanding that itemized deductions would allow a significant tax benefit. Had Congress known that higher-income taxpayers would be disallowed some of their itemized deductions, as the President now proposes, undoubtedly Congress would have set that bracket at lower than 35%. So taking away some of the benefit of itemized deductions for higher-income taxpayers while leaving the higher-income tax rates at their current levels upsets the balance struck by prior Congresses. Obviously, Congress is allowed to do this, but let's not pretend that these expenditures are loopholes or oversights by prior Congresses. The President and the Senate's Democratic leadership are free to do this if they choose, but they should at least come clean about what they are doing. They are significantly raising taxes on the people who are already shouldering the lion's share of the federal income tax burden, 98% of it, as a matter of fact. Even aside from the staggering character of this tax increase, one that would clearly violate President Obama's campaign pledge not to raise taxes on the middle-class Americans, the macroeconomic impact of this cap is negative at best. President Obama's 28% cap would reduce the benefit from the home mortgage interest deduction. For 5 years now, our nation has been experiencing a bursting of the real estate bubble. Current headlines indicate that this trend will continue for a time. Limiting the value of the home mortgage interest deduction would apply additional downward pressure on home prices, not only for high-end homes, but for all homes. By repeatedly proposing to limit the benefit of the home mortgage interest deduction, is it the President's intent to further depress housing prices, or is this mere collateral damage from his desire to raise taxes? But the damage from this cap does not stop at the housing market. President Obama's 28% cap would also reduce the benefit from the charitable contribution deduction. This would almost surely reduce the amount of contributions people make to churches, synagogues, temples, soup kitchens, shelters, universities, and museums, just to mention a few. Is that the President's intention? Does the President know that these revenues might never materialize because the elimination of this deduction will step up pressure for direct government assistance for the poor, for students, and for the arts? Finally, this cap would reduce the benefit of the state and local tax deduction. I touched on this point earlier. High-tax states are able to soften the blow of their high taxes by pointing out to their citizens the federal deductibility of such taxes. So my colleagues from high-tax states might want to talk to their governors about the impact the President's proposed cap would have on state and local public finance. Mr. President, I want to be clear about something. Our tax code is a colossal, awful mess. And tax expenditures must be a part of any conversation about tax reform. But I want to emphasize that the conversation about tax expenditures should happen in a conversation about broad-based tax reform. Reform that flattens the code while lowering rates. The conversation about tax expenditures should be a sober one in the context of a meaningful discussion about tax policy. Unfortunately, the President has chosen instead to target tax expenditures willy-nilly with little regard for the policy implications of these tax hikes. And make no mistake, whatever the President wants to call it, reducing spending through the tax code, closing loopholes, or making people pay their fair share, these are tax increases plain and simple. And they are tax increases on the middle class. There has been some criticism in recent days about Republicans for their commitment to a pledge many of them took against any tax increase. I have to admit I'm at a loss here. Conservative Republicans, convinced that taxes are already high enough, promise their tax-paying citizens that they will never support a net tax increase. They gave their constituents their word, and they're sticking to it. Meanwhile, President Obama, who promised not to raise taxes on the middle class when running for office, vows to break his promise at every opportunity. And yet it is the conservative Republicans who are somehow lacking integrity? Hardly. Mr. President, I don't care how many blows I take from sophisticated Washingtonians and professional leftists for sticking by my pledge to the people of Utah. I will resist any effort by the President to include tax increases as part of the deal to increase the debt ceiling. I will do so for a number of reasons. First, our tax code needs a fundamental overhaul. It is a complicated mess that is lacking in fundamental fairness. Yet the President's proposal to reduce tax expenditures for deficit reduction is a proposal to maintain a tax code that grows more burdensome by the day. The President's proposal essentially robs the government of the revenues that it might use later to flatten the tax code and lower rates. More importantly, I oppose the President's proposed tax hikes as a matter of principle. Flattening the tax base without any offsetting rate reduction is a tax increase. My friend, the ranking member on the Senate Budget Committee, Senator Sessions, captured the point well in an interview the other day. I'll quote Senator Sessions. We have to be honest and recognize that if you're going to eliminate systematically a host of deductions and keep the money or spend it on new programs, then you've raised taxes. It just is, unless we've changed the English language, unquote. The campaign against tax expenditures is a campaign for a tax increase. It is a tax increase that could send the wrong signal to those Americans who sacrifice current consumption and save for retirement. It could raise the bar for those Americans who want to experience the American dream of home ownership. It would mean the residents of high-tax states would face even higher state and local taxes. And it could mean a cutback back in the volume of charitable giving. This is shared sacrifice that the nation cannot afford. I preferred shared prosperity by cutting taxes and giving these small businesses and businesses the opportunity to use that money to hire people and get people working and get more people paying taxes. And I think it's abysmal that the bottom 51% do not pay income taxes, and 23 million of them get refundable tax credits from the government that are far more than the payroll taxes that they might have to pay, which are Social Security payments. Is he going to come back? Mr. President, I listened to my colleague from Vermont saying that we cannot do anything on Social Security, we can't do this, we can't do that, the poor people are going to be hurt. Where are they going to be when Social Security is bankrupt? Where are they going to be when Medicaid and Medicare are bankrupt? The way we're going, that's where they're going to be. We can't keep spending like this, and we've got to quit playing the phony game with tax expenditures. All I can say is that we have got to get with it around here. And we've got to start working together as Democrats and Republicans in the best interest of the American people, and that is reforming this awful tax code, getting taxes down for everybody, and taking care of the poor, but also expecting everybody to have some skin in the game, except the really poor, and help our country to pull out of the mess that we're in. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.